My name is Taylor. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles where being dependable mattered more than being visible. I'm the person people describe as steady, low maintenance, the one who doesn't need much supervision. If you passed me in a hallway, you probably wouldn't remember my shoes, my voice, or what I said 5 minutes later. And for a long time, that felt like proof I was doing something right. People tend to underestimate me, not in a dramatic way, more like a quiet assumption that I'll adapt, that I won't push back, that I'll absorb discomfort and keep things moving. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice. I don't announce my boundaries with sharp edges. I learned early that calm competence often gets mistaken for passivity, and I let that misunderstanding exist because it made life simpler. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or winning some public reckoning. It's about something slower and harder to name. It's about what happens when trust erodes so gradually that you don't notice the moment it breaks. It's about I was gaslit into questioning my own memory at work, and the subtle, corrosive effect of being told, again and again, that your recollection isn't reliable. It's about meetings that supposedly never happened, decisions that were never discussed, and the quiet shock of hearing they denied conversations I clearly remembered. What you're about to hear unfolds over years, not days. There are no dramatic confrontations in conference rooms, no slammed doors. The tension lives mostly inside, in the pause before you speak, in the way you start checking your notes twice, in the moment you wonder whether it's easier to doubt yourself than to challenge the room. This is a story about emotional justice, but not the loud kind. The kind that happens when clarity replaces confusion, and silence becomes intentional rather than imposed. I'm telling this now because I promised myself I would tell it honestly. That means no exaggeration, no theatrics, and no simplifying people into heroes or monsters. Everyone involved believed they were being reasonable, including me, especially me. And that's what made it so disorienting. If you stay with me, you'll hear how being overlooked can slowly turn into being rewritten, how composure can be misread as consent, and how regaining your footing doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, and a choice made long before anyone else realizes the ground has shifted. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, gently, without expectation. Have you ever had a moment where you wondered whether you remembered something wrong? Not because you were careless, but because someone needed you to? To them, I was useful. That's the simplest way to put it. Not indispensable, not impressive, just reliably useful. I was the person who remembered deadlines without being asked, who followed up when others forgot, who filled in gaps quietly so meetings could end on time. My name showed up on shared documents and internal emails, but rarely in conversations about direction or credit. And for a long time, I accepted that as the natural order of things. I wasn't hired to be loud. I was hired to make things run. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table, not physically far, just far enough that no one felt crowded by my presence. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, it was usually to clarify something practical, timelines, dependencies, risks no one else wanted to name. People nodded, took mental notes, and moved on. My contributions were absorbed into the group, unattributed, like background infrastructure. No one was cruel about it. That's important. There were no insults, no raised eyebrows when I talked, just a consistent pattern of being overlooked in small, almost polite ways. Decisions would be summarized without referencing my input. Plans would change without looping me in, even when I was responsible for execution. When I asked questions, I was thanked for being thorough. Thorough is another word for invisible. If you'd asked my coworkers who I was, they would have said I was dependable, easy to work with, not dramatic, someone who handled things. And if you'd asked them whether I had influence, they probably would have paused, then said something like, "Well, not really, but she's great at what she does." I didn't mind at first. There's a kind of safety in that position. When expectations are low, mistakes are forgiven. When attention isn't on you, pressure dissipates. I told myself I preferred it this way, that I wasn't interested in politics or recognition, that I valued stability over visibility, and some of that was true. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't see yet, was that being perceived as invisible also meant being perceived as flexible, malleable, someone whose version of events could be adjusted without resistance. If I remembered something differently, it was assumed I was mistaken, not that the room was wrong. At the time, it didn't feel like erasure. It felt like efficiency. I was the person people spoke to without noticing they had done it. The person whose emails got responses 3 days later, if at all. The person copied for awareness, not for decision. And because I didn't protest, because I continued delivering consistent results, the role solidified. I became part of the system rather than a voice within it. Looking back, I can see how carefully I maintained that image myself. I didn't interrupt because I didn't want to derail conversations. I didn't correct people publicly because I didn't want to embarrass them. I didn't insist on credit because the work mattered more than my name. Each choice was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of disappearance. Still, I trusted the environment. I trusted that facts were shared in good faith, that disagreements were acknowledged honestly, that memory, while imperfect, wasn't weaponized. I believed that if something important had been said, it would be remembered. If a decision had been made, it would be documented. If my understanding differed, we would talk it through. That belief is what made everything that followed so destabilizing. Because when you're seen as calm and agreeable, people don't expect you to hold firm. They expect you to adjust. And when you don't push back, they start assuming you won't. Over time, your silence becomes part of the process. Your presence becomes background noise. I didn't know yet that my role wasn't just reliable support. It was something more specific. It was someone whose reality could be quietly reshaped. And at that stage, I still thought that if I stayed careful, stayed reasonable, stayed helpful, clarity would naturally prevail. I thought truth had momentum on its own. I was wrong, but not in the way you might expect. The first time it happened, I didn't react. Not because I didn't notice, because I did, but because it seemed too small to matter. The kind of thing you assume will correct itself once everyone has more information. The kind of thing you tell yourself not to be sensitive about. It was a planning meeting, routine, weekly. We were discussing a workflow change that would affect 3 teams, including mine. I remember it clearly because I had flagged a dependency issue the week before and followed up with a short summary email. During the meeting, I explained, calmly, that if we moved the deadline forward, we'd need written confirmation from a vendor. It wasn't a dramatic objection, just a factual note. There was a pause. Someone nodded. The conversation moved on. 2 weeks later, when the delay happened, the same manager looked at me and said, almost casually, "We never talked about vendor confirmation. This is the first I'm hearing of it." The room stayed quiet. I felt a small, sharp confusion, not panic, not anger, just a brief internal recalibration. I was sure we had talked about it. I could picture the slide on the screen, the order of speakers, and the way I had phrased the concern to keep it neutral. But the certainty wobbled when no one else spoke up. I said, "I mentioned it in the meeting before last," and I sent a follow-up email. He smiled, not unkindly, and said, "I don't remember that. Are you sure?" That was it. That was the cut. No accusation, no hostility, just a gentle implication that my memory might be unreliable. The kind of question that sounds reasonable enough to accept without protest. And because it was framed that way, because it wasn't aggressive, I felt almost rude insisting. I pulled up the email. He glanced at it and said, Right, I must have missed that. Still, it wasn't a decision. The conversation moved on again, but something had shifted. Not externally, internally. A tiny fracture formed between what I remembered and what was acknowledged. I told myself it was normal. People forget things. Meetings blur together. Memory isn't perfect. Still, I replayed it later. Not obsessively, just enough to check myself. Had I been clear? Had I assumed agreement where there wasn't any? Maybe I hadn't emphasized it enough. Maybe I should have followed up verbally. That's the thing about the first cut. It doesn't bleed. it just introduces doubt. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small, plausible, a comment I was sure had been made that apparently never came up. A suggestion attributed to the group that I distinctly remembered originating with me. Each time the response was the same: mild surprise, gentle dismissal, a suggestion that I might be conflating conversations. No one was gaslighting me overtly. No one said I was wrong outright. They just didn't agree with my version of events. And because I was the only one holding it, my certainty felt heavier, less portable. I started compensating without realizing it, taking more notes, saving emails I would have deleted before, adding timestamps, not because I planned to use them, just to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining things. And still, I didn't speak up much. I told myself it wasn't worth slowing things down, that these were minor discrepancies, that pushing back would make me seem defensive. I had built a reputation on being easy to work with, and I didn't want to fracture it over what could easily be explained as miscommunication. What unsettled me most wasn't that someone denied remembering a conversation. It was how easily everyone else accepted that denial as reality. The room always moved forward without friction, leaving my memory behind like an unnecessary detail. I began to notice how often truth depended on who said it last. If someone with authority summarized a meeting incorrectly, it became the record. If I corrected it gently, it was framed as my interpretation. The language mattered. You said versus I remember. One was firm, the other was soft. I hadn't yet seen a pattern. I saw exceptions, anomalies, individual moments of misunderstanding. And because I believed in fairness, I kept assuming clarity would reassert itself. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, I hesitated before trusting my own recall. Not enough to panic, but enough to pause. Enough to ask myself quietly, what if I'm wrong? What if? That question didn't protect me. It trained me. Once doubt is introduced, it doesn't need reinforcement to survive. It adapts. It blends into routine. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, it becomes normal. The dismissals didn't escalate. They stabilized. That's what made them dangerous. There were no more moments sharp enough to provoke immediate alarm. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of small contradictions. I would reference a conversation and someone would say, that wasn't the takeaway. I would recall an agreement and it would be reframed as a tentative idea. I would ask why a decision had changed and be told it had always been that way. Each time the explanation was reasonable on its own. Memory is subjective, context evolves, intent shifts. And because no one else seemed bothered, I began adjusting myself rather than challenging the narrative. I learned to soften my language. Instead of saying, we agreed, I said, I thought we had discussed. Instead of this was decided, I said, my understanding was. I added qualifiers to my own experiences as if preemptively apologizing for having them. No one asked me to do this. That's important. The system didn't coerce me overtly. It rewarded accommodation. When I was flexible, things flowed. When I insisted, there was friction. Subtle, polite, exhausting friction. The kind that made you feel like the problem, even when you were calm. So I stayed quiet more often. Not completely silent, just strategically minimal. I spoke when necessary. I followed up in writing. I tried to anticipate changes rather than question them. I became very good at adapting to moving targets, even when I had helped set the original direction. From the outside, I probably looked composed, cooperative, professional. Inside, I was constantly recalibrating. I began reviewing my notes after meetings, not to prepare tasks, but to reassure myself that I hadn't imagined entire exchanges. I reread email threads to confirm tone, sequence, and intent. I trusted documentation more than memory, not because memory had failed me, but because it had been challenged. And slowly, something else happened. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. When a project succeeded, I didn't wait for recognition. When a process changed without explanation, I adjusted without asking why. When my input was echoed later by someone else, I let it pass. It was easier that way. Less resistance, less energy spent defending my own perception of events. I told myself I was being mature. This is how organizations work, I thought. You pick your battles. You don't cling to every detail. You focus on outcomes, not ego. But the cost of that logic was subtle erosion, because each time I let a discrepancy slide, I reinforced the idea that my version of reality was negotiable. Each time I reframed my certainty as a misunderstanding, I trained myself to defer. Over time, that deference became automatic. What I didn't realize then was that this pattern wasn't invisible to others. People noticed that I didn't push back, that I absorbed changes without complaint, that I didn't correct narratives unless absolutely necessary, and even then, gently. And they adjusted accordingly, not maliciously, just practically. Why debate someone who will adapt anyway? The role I had been quietly occupying solidified further. I became the person who would figure it out, who didn't need the full context, who could be counted on to clean up ambiguity without making noise. That reputation brought trust, but not authority. And trust without authority is a dangerous combination, because when things went wrong, it was assumed I could handle it. When things went right, it was assumed they would have anyway. My presence smoothed edges, but it also blurred accountability. I remember one afternoon sitting at my desk, rereading a meeting summary that didn't match my notes. I considered replying with a correction. It would have been factual, brief, reasonable. I didn't send it, not because it was wrong, but because I didn't want to be that person, the one who nitpicked, the one who disrupted consensus, the one who insisted on precision when everyone else had already moved on. That choice felt small. It wasn't. It marked the moment I stopped expecting the system to protect truth and started protecting myself by staying quiet. And for a while, that strategy worked. At least, it felt like it did. Roles don't always get assigned out loud. Sometimes they form in the negative space, through what's not asked of you, what you're not invited into, what assumptions harden without discussion. By the time you notice them, they feel established, almost contractual, even though you never agreed. I began to see mine clearly in the way conversations happened around me. I was included early, when ideas were still loose and tasks needed structuring. I was less present later, when decisions carried weight. I'd help shape the framework, then watch it get finalized elsewhere. When I asked about changes, I was told they were minor adjustments, even when they altered the entire direction of the work. The expectation wasn't that I would challenge outcomes. It was that I would implement them. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need hand-holding, the one who wouldn't escalate or make things uncomfortable. And because I had absorbed so many shifts quietly, people began to assume I always would. It showed in small ways. Meetings are scheduled without checking my availability. Deadlines moved without consultation. Information shared after the fact, framed as a courtesy rather than a requirement. When I asked clarifying questions, the answers were brief, sometimes incomplete, as if the full context wasn't necessary for me. At first, I thought this was efficiency, trust, the natural consequence of being competent. But competence had quietly become containment. The more capable I proved myself to be, the less people felt obligated to include me in decisions that affected my work. My adaptability became a resource. My silence became consent. And then there was the tone. When others disagreed, it was called healthy debate. When I disagreed, rarely, cautiously, it was treated as confusion, as if I hadn't fully grasped the situation, as if my memory of prior discussions was somehow less authoritative than the latest summary offered by someone else. I noticed how often phrases like, "what we meant was," or "the understanding has always been," replaced actual references to what had been said. And I noticed how quickly those reframings were accepted as truth. No one asked me to confirm. No one checked alignment. The story was rewritten in real time, and I was expected to adapt to the new version without comment. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. My role wasn't just supportive, it was stabilizing. I absorbed inconsistencies so others didn't have to face them. I held together narratives that didn't quite line up, and by doing so, I protected the system from friction. That made me valuable. It also made me invisible. I remember realizing, one afternoon, that people spoke around me rather than to me. Decisions were discussed as if I were already aligned, already compliant. My presence was assumed, not engaged. I wasn't consulted because I was predictable, and predictability, in this context, meant I wouldn't challenge the version of reality that made things easiest. The most unsettling part wasn't that others had expectations of me. It was that I had met them so consistently that they felt justified. I had trained people how to treat my perspective, optional, adjustable, secondary, and once a role like that is established, deviating from it feels like a breach. I began to sense a quiet pressure, not explicit, but palpable, a sense that if I pushed back now, it would be seen as a change in my temperament, not a response to circumstances. That I would be the one disrupting the flow. So I stayed within the lines. I did my job well. I met expectations. I continued documenting quietly, asking questions sparingly, absorbing discrepancies without protest. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. The system functioned smoothly. But internally, something had shifted. I no longer believed clarity would emerge on its own. I started watching more closely, not out of suspicion, out of necessity. I paid attention to who spoke with certainty and who hedged, to whose memories were treated as authoritative and whose were treated as negotiable. I noticed how narratives solidified not through accuracy, but through repetition and power. And in that observation, a new understanding formed. If my role was to be reliable and invisible, then changing my circumstances wouldn't come from speaking louder. It would come from seeing clearly. There wasn't an argument. There wasn't even a conversation. The shift happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the space between tasks, when nothing urgent demanded my attention. That's what made it so definitive. No adrenaline, no defensiveness, just clarity. I was reviewing notes from a meeting that had taken place earlier that week. Routine again. Familiar faces, familiar patterns. As I compared my handwritten notes with the official summary that had been circulated, I noticed a familiar discrepancy. A decision presented as settled had, in reality, been deferred. I remembered the hesitation in the room, the way no one committed, the exact words used to postpone it, and yet, there it was in writing, resolved, agreed, final. Normally, I would have flagged it or let it go. That was the pattern. Correct gently or adapt quietly. This time I did neither. I just stopped. I sat back in my chair and read the summary again, slowly. Not to argue with it, but to observe my reaction. There was no spike in anxiety, no urge to defend my memory, just a steady recognition. This keeps happening, and it's not accidental. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with relief, because if it wasn't random, then it wasn't my fault. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that my memory wasn't the unreliable variable in the equation, that the inconsistencies weren't misunderstandings to be smoothed over, but patterns to be acknowledged, that the quiet discomfort I'd been carrying wasn't sensitivity, it was data. I didn't send an email. I didn't schedule a meeting. I didn't confront anyone. I opened my notebook, not the digital one I shared with the team, the old leather one I'd been carrying for years, filled with dates and observations that had never been meant as evidence, just as reassurance. I flipped back through pages, not skimming, but reading, and what I saw was consistency. Meetings where I had noted concerns that later never came up, decisions that shifted without acknowledgement, language that softened commitments after the fact. It wasn't every interaction. It didn't need to be. The pattern was selective and directional, always away from accountability, always away from clarity, always away from me. Something settled in my chest then, not resentment, resolve. I realized that waiting for validation from the same system that benefited from my doubt was pointless. That clarity wouldn't be granted. It would have to be claimed, quietly, on my own terms. That was the day my silence changed meaning. Before, silence had been a response, a way to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to preserve relationships. After that moment, silence became a choice. I stopped explaining myself internally, stopped rehearsing justifications I never voiced. I trusted my memory without needing external confirmation. Not because I suddenly believed I was infallible, but because I understood the alternative, constant self-doubt, was a vulnerability others were unconsciously exploiting. I began observing without engaging. In meetings, I listened more than ever, but differently. I noted who reframed past conversations, who spoke with authority without reference, who deferred when clarity was requested. I watched how quickly uncertainty was projected onto the quietest person in the room, and I stopped correcting. That part surprised me. I had assumed that once I saw the pattern, I would want to break it. Instead, I let it reveal itself further. Not out of passivity, but out of intention. I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before deciding how to respond. This wasn't about catching anyone out. It was about reclaiming my internal anchor, about no longer outsourcing my sense of reality to people who had shown they couldn't or wouldn't hold it with integrity. I still did my work, still delivered, still showed up calm and prepared. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. I knew then that whatever came next wouldn't involve confrontation. It wouldn't be loud or reactive. It would be precise, grounded, irreversible. But I didn't rush it, because once you stop doubting yourself, you don't need to hurry. You just need to pay attention. Once silence stops being a reflex, it takes on a different weight. Mine did. I didn't announce a change. I didn't correct course publicly or draw boundaries with new language. I simply stopped volunteering my certainty. I let conversations unfold without anchoring them. And in that absence, something revealing happened. People filled the space. They spoke more confidently. They summarized more decisively. They referenced past conversations with increasing assurance, even when those conversations had been ambiguous or unresolved. Without my gentle clarifications, the narratives hardened faster, and often inaccurately. No one noticed my restraint as intentional. They interpreted it as acquiescence. In meetings, when decisions were restated incorrectly, I nodded. When my prior input was reframed as tentative or omitted entirely, I didn't intervene. I asked fewer questions. I took fewer turns speaking. I remained present, attentive, calm. From the outside, it looked like compliance. From the inside, it was observation. I was learning how much of the system relied on my quiet corrections to function smoothly. Without them, inconsistencies accumulated, tasks overlapped, assumptions clashed, small errors surfaced, not catastrophically, but enough to reveal fault lines. And still no one connected it to my silence. Instead, they began assuming more responsibility without more authority, more execution without more context, more adaptation without acknowledgement. I was trusted to handle it, even when the inputs were flawed. That trust was misplaced, but it was also informative. I began documenting with intention, not just outcomes or dates, but language. Who said what? How commitments were framed, when certainty replaced ambiguity. I noted tone shifts, patterns of deflection, moments where accountability subtly changed hands. I didn't share any of this. That was the key difference. Before, my notes had been a private reassurance. Now, they were a strategic asset, not for retaliation, for clarity. I also noticed how differently people treated silence depending on who it came from. When someone senior paused, it was interpreted as thoughtfulness. When someone outspoken paused, it was seen as restraint. When I paused, it was assumed I had nothing to add. That assumption created space for others to overstate, to contradict themselves, to make claims that couldn't be supported later. My silence became a mirror, and in it, people revealed their habits. There was a meeting where a timeline was presented as agreed upon weeks ago. I remembered the exact moment it had been proposed and tabled. I remembered the lack of follow-up. I said nothing. 2 weeks later, when the deadline was missed, the explanation shifted. Suddenly, the agreement had been aspirational. The language softened. Accountability diffused. No one looked at me, and that told me everything. They weren't relying on my memory anymore. They were relying on my adaptability, on my willingness to absorb consequences quietly. But something else had changed too. I no longer felt the urge to protect the collective narrative. I let contradictions stand. I let summaries go uncorrected, not because I agreed, but because I understood the value of letting patterns complete themselves. This wasn't passive resistance, it was deliberate restraint. And it worked because it was invisible. No one feels threatened by silence. They interpret it as weakness. No one guards themselves against someone they believe won't challenge them. That miscalculation gave me time. Time to understand the system fully before deciding how to exit it or reshape my position within it. I also began setting internal boundaries. I stopped compensating emotionally. I didn't feel responsible for smoothing over confusion or preserving morale. I did my job well, but I stopped carrying the weight of others' inconsistency. That lightness surprised me. Without the constant effort to align reality with narrative, I had more mental space, more energy, more clarity. The anxiety I'd mistaken for professionalism began to fade. Silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's containment, and containment creates pressure. I could feel it building, not around me, but around the system itself. The cracks were subtle, but they were there, and no one was looking in my direction because I had never been seen as a source of disruption. That was their mistake, because silence had stopped being my shield. It had become my leverage. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was an accumulation. While conversations repeated themselves in slightly altered forms, while summaries grew more confident and less accurate, I was quietly building a parallel record. Not an emotional one, a factual one. Dates, language, sequence, cause, and effect. I didn't rush it. I let time do some of the work. Every organization leaves a paper trail. Not always a clean one, but a revealing one. Emails contradict meetings. Calendars expose omissions. Version histories tell stories no one intends to tell. I had access to all of it, not because I was powerful, but because I was useful. And usefulness grants proximity. I began organizing my notes differently. Not chronologically, but thematically. Patterns of deflection. Reframing after the fact. Decisions that never happened, but somehow shaped months of work. I cross-referenced my observations with documentation that already existed, quietly validating what I already knew. The result wasn't shocking. It was consistent. I also started learning, deliberately, about process governance, about accountability frameworks, about how decisions are supposed to be recorded, approved, and communicated. Not because I planned to escalate, but because understanding the rules clarified when they were being bent. And they were being bent selectively. Certain people were afforded flexibility. Others absorbed the consequences. Authority flowed upward. Responsibility flowed outward. And because I had been absorbing responsibility without asserting authority, I was positioned perfectly to see where those flows misaligned. No one questioned my presence in these systems. I was trusted with details others found tedious. I was looped in for support, not realizing that support roles often sit closest to the truth. I noticed how often language did the work of erasure, aligned instead of agreed, socialized instead of approved, understood instead of documented. Each substitution created plausible deniability. And because I had watched it happen repeatedly, I could see how intentional the ambiguity had become. Not necessarily malicious, but protective. Protective of status, of hierarchy, of comfort. I also paid attention to timing. Who spoke first in meetings? Who summarized last? Who followed up in writing? Authority wasn't just about titles. It was about narrative control. Whoever framed the outcome controlled the memory. So I stopped competing for that role. Instead, I positioned myself adjacent to it. I ensured I was copied on follow-ups without initiating them. I attended meetings without steering them. I listened for what was said and what wasn't. I noted when commitments were implied rather than stated, and I waited. Patience is underrated as a form of strength, because over time, small inconsistencies compound. 1 contradiction is forgettable. 5 form a pattern. 10 form a liability. They never noticed how much I saw because I never reacted. I never corrected. I never escalated. I remained exactly who they thought I was. Reliable, calm, invisible. But invisibility has advantages. No one guards against the person they underestimate. No one audits their own statements in front of someone they believe won't challenge them. And so people spoke freely, carelessly, confidently. They told different versions of the same story to different audiences. They contradicted themselves in writing. They reframed commitments without checking who remembered the original framing. I remembered. And more importantly, I could prove it. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. Because preparation isn't about collecting ammunition. It's about understanding timing. About knowing when intervention clarifies and when it destabilizes. I wasn't interested in exposing anyone publicly. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in something quieter and more durable. Autonomy. The ability to step out of a system that relied on my doubt to function. The ability to protect my credibility without pleading for it. The ability to make a decision that couldn't be rewritten later. What they never noticed was that my silence had shifted again. It was no longer just strategic. It was complete. I had stopped needing acknowledgement, stopped needing agreement, stopped needing validation. I knew what I knew, and I knew when I would use it. Not to punish, to exit cleanly, to reclaim authorship of my own narrative. And when the moment came, they wouldn't see it as retaliation. They would see it as inevitable. The reveal didn't come with a rush of triumph. There was no moment where I leaned back and smiled, no sense of victory or vindication. What I felt instead was something quieter and more grounding, a narrowing of uncertainty, a sense that the fog I'd been moving through had finally lifted enough for me to see the terrain clearly. It happened late one evening, after most people had logged off. I was reviewing a set of documents connected to a long-running initiative, one that had changed shape several times without ever being formally reapproved, the kind of project that lives in gray zones, sustained by momentum rather than clarity. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. That's important. I had learned not to hunt for conclusions. I let patterns emerge on their own. As I traced the timeline, meeting notes, follow-up emails, updated scopes, I noticed something precise and undeniable. A decision that leadership insisted had never been finalized, had in fact been approved. Not informally, not implied. Formally, there it was, a written confirmation sent to external stakeholders, committing to a direction that internal leadership later claimed was misunderstood. The date mattered, the sender mattered, the phrasing was unambiguous, and suddenly the last 2 years rearranged themselves. All the reframing, all the selective memory, all the moments where accountability slid sideways and landed on teams like mine. It wasn't chaos, it was containment, a way of benefiting from commitment while denying responsibility for its consequences. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not to decide what to do, but to notice how I felt. There was no anger, no urge to expose anyone, just a deep, steady calm. Because this wasn't about being right anymore. It was about understanding the system well enough to step out of its distortions. The leverage wasn't explosive, it wasn't scandalous, it was structural. The organization relied on plausible deniability, on blurred lines between discussion and decision, on the assumption that no one would quietly connect all the dots, especially not someone positioned as supportive rather than authoritative. But I had connected them. And once you see leverage for what it is, you don't need to wield it aggressively. You just need to recognize the options it creates. I realized I didn't need to argue about memory anymore. I didn't need to defend my recall or correct summaries in real time. The question was no longer who's right, it was what do I want. That shift was everything. I spent the next few days reviewing my documentation with fresh eyes, not as evidence to present, but as information to inform a decision. I mapped out where my responsibilities exceeded my authority, where risk had been transferred downward without acknowledgement, where ambiguity had protected some and burdened others. And I asked myself a hard clarifying question. If nothing changed, could I stay here without betraying myself? The answer came quickly. No, not because the work was unbearable, not because the people were malicious, but because remaining would require me to continue absorbing distortions I could now see clearly, and pretending I couldn't. The leverage gave me a choice. Not power over others, power over myself. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. I didn't hint. I didn't shift my behavior noticeably. I continued as I had, calm and competent, while internally the path forward solidified. This was the private reveal. Not the discovery of wrongdoing, but the discovery of freedom. I understood then that quiet dominance doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from clarity, from knowing where you stand so firmly that you no longer need the room's agreement. They could deny conversations. They could rewrite summaries. They could question memory. It no longer mattered, because my next move wouldn't depend on their version of events. It would depend on mine, and once that decision crystallized, there was no urgency, only precision. I would move carefully, cleanly, in a way that couldn't be reframed later, not to prove anything, but to close a chapter on my own terms. Once you see the exit, you can't pretend the room is still the whole world. That was the quiet tension I carried into the decision point. Not urgency, not fear, but a narrowing field of options. I knew there were several paths available to me, and I took the time to walk each one mentally, without emotion, without fantasy. I could confront leadership directly, present the documentation, ask for acknowledgement, push for correction. I imagined how that would unfold. The careful language, the expressions of surprise, the reframing, the assurances that this was never the intention. Even if I succeeded in clarifying the facts, the cost would be permanent visibility. I would become difficult, detail-oriented, sensitive to misalignment. My credibility would depend on continued vigilance. That path required constant defense. I could escalate formally, file concerns, trigger reviews, force accountability through process. That path would be slow, draining, and deeply entangled. It would anchor me to the very system that had benefited from my silence. Even if it led to change, I would still be standing in the aftermath, responsible for navigating the fallout. That path required endurance. I could stay, do nothing, continue adapting. That option had once felt like professionalism. Now it felt like self-erasure. Staying would mean accepting that my clarity had no place here unless it was convenient. It would mean knowing the truth and agreeing to live as if I didn't. That path required self-betrayal. There was one option left. It was the quietest and the most final. I could leave in a way that preserved my integrity and made the distortions visible without accusation. I could remove the stabilizing force I had unknowingly been providing and let the system confront its own inconsistencies. This wasn't an impulsive choice. I gave it time. Weeks. I watched how things continued to unfold. I observed how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, how frequently responsibility flowed toward me without authority following. Nothing changed, and that too was information. The irreversible choice wasn't departure alone. It was how I would depart, not in protest, not in anger, not with revelations or ultimatums, but with precision, with boundaries, with timing that respected my own clarity rather than their convenience. I began preparing quietly. I reviewed my obligations, documented transitions, ensured continuity. I didn't hoard information or create gaps. I did the opposite. I made everything transparent, accessible, and organized. Because quiet dominance isn't about withholding. It's about refusing to compensate. I drafted a resignation that was brief and factual. No grievances. No explanations beyond what was required. I didn't cite memory disputes or misalignment. I didn't ask for change or understanding. I simply stated a decision. The moment I finalized it, something settled in me completely. The anxiety I hadn't realized I was carrying evaporated, not replaced by excitement, but by steadiness. I hadn't chosen a dramatic ending. I had chosen authorship. This was the point of no return. Not because it would shock anyone, but because it returned agency to me. Once I committed internally, the rest was logistics. They would try to interpret my decision later, to attach meaning, to explain it in ways that preserved their version of events. That was fine. I didn't need to control the narrative anymore. I only needed to ensure that my exit couldn't be reframed as impulsive, emotional, or confused. It had to be clean enough that any reinterpretation would feel strained, and I was ready to do that. I scheduled the conversation, prepared the handover, maintained the same calm professionalism I always had. Nothing about my demeanor signaled finality, but internally, the choice had already done its work. I no longer needed leverage. I had used it to free myself. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of my career, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was happening out of sight. I didn't announce my intentions early. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I didn't withdraw effort or disengage emotionally. On the surface, I was exactly who I had always been. Consistent, responsive, calm. That continuity mattered. It kept assumptions intact. While others focused on immediate deliverables, I focused on alignment between what I knew, what I owed, and what I would no longer carry forward. I reviewed my contract carefully, not looking for loopholes, just clarity. Notice periods, non-compete language, ownership boundaries. I wanted to be precise, not reactive. Quiet dominance is often just preparation done early enough that it never needs to be defended later. I also took stock financially. I didn't make dramatic moves or radical changes. I simply ensured optionality. savings accessible, commitments minimized, decisions deferred where possible. Independence isn't built in a single gesture, it's assembled quietly, piece by piece. At work, I began transferring knowledge deliberately, not abruptly, not in a way that raised concern. I documented processes more thoroughly than usual. Updated shared folders, clarified handoffs. I framed it as optimization, something I had always been praised for. No one questioned it. Why would they? I had always been the person who made things easier. I noticed something interesting during this phase. As I stepped back from compensating without stepping away, small frictions emerged. Questions that would normally come to me first were redirected elsewhere. Decisions stalled slightly. Not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to register subconsciously. Still, no one asked if anything was wrong. My silence had been normalized for so long that it no longer signaled anything unusual. I also stopped absorbing emotional labor. When ambiguity surfaced, I didn't rush to resolve it. When timelines clashed, I clarified my responsibilities and stopped there. When assumptions were made about my availability, I corrected them gently, without explanation. These weren't confrontations. They were boundaries expressed as facts. And because they were calm and consistent, they went largely unnoticed. I didn't vent to colleagues. I didn't seek validation. I didn't frame my preparation as survival. It wasn't survival. It was alignment. The most important work happened internally. I rehearsed nothing. I didn't plan speeches or explanations. I let go of the urge to be understood. That urge had kept me entangled far longer than necessary. Instead, I focused on coherence. When the moment came, my actions would match my internal clarity. No contradiction, no hesitation. That coherence is unsettling to people who rely on confusion, but they didn't know it was coming. The day I submitted my notice looked like any other day. I logged in on time, attended meetings, answered questions. Then, at the scheduled moment, I sent a brief message requesting a conversation. No urgency, no emotion, just logistics. Until then, my movement had been invisible because it hadn't broken character. I hadn't become someone new. I had simply stopped compensating for a system that depended on my silence. That's what moving in silence really is. Not secrecy, not deception. It's preparation without performance. And by the time anyone noticed, the shift was already complete. The first reactions were subtle. Not panic, not outrage, just a slight, almost imperceptible destabilization. Like a building adjusting to the removal of a beam no one realized was load-bearing. When my notice became known, the initial response was polite surprise. Questions framed as concern. "We didn't realize you were thinking of leaving. Is there anything we can do?" The tone was calm, professional, almost rehearsed. I kept my responses simple. I thanked them, I confirmed timelines. I redirected to transition plans. I didn't elaborate. And that restraint did something unexpected. It created a vacuum. Without a clear reason to discuss, people began filling the gap with their own interpretations. I could see it in the way conversation shifted, in the questions asked sideways rather than directly, in the sudden attention to details that had been overlooked for years. Tasks that had always flowed through me began stalling, not dramatically, but noticeably. People realized they didn't know certain processes as well as they thought. That some context had lived with me, quietly maintained, never formalized, because it never had to be. Now it did. I was asked for clarification, then for more clarification, then for summaries of things that had never been questioned before. I provided them, clearly, concisely, without commentary. I didn't rush. I noticed how often people preface questions with, "Just to make sure I'm remembering this right." The phrase landed differently now. Memory, once fluid and negotiable, was suddenly something they wanted anchored. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meetings changed tone. Decisions slowed. People began referencing documentation more carefully. The same individuals who had once dismissed precision now sought it, but no one connected this shift to the way my memory had been treated. They framed the disruption as a transition challenge, as growing pains, as temporary. What they felt, but didn't name, was the loss of a stabilizer. Without me quietly correcting narratives, contradictions surfaced. Different teams remembered agreements differently. Summaries conflicted. Accountability blurred. The very patterns I had been absorbing began to circulate outward. I could see it in real time. And still I said nothing. There was no satisfaction in watching this unfold. No sense of "I told you so." just a steady confirmation that my presence had been compensatory, that I had been smoothing over systemic inconsistencies without recognition. People began reaching out individually, not to ask why I was leaving, but to ask how things worked, to ask for context, to ask what I thought should be done. I answered the first kind of question. I declined the second. I was careful not to step back and into the role I was exiting. I didn't offer opinions on future decisions. I didn't mediate confusion. I limited my responses to what was necessary for a clean handover. That boundary was new, and it unsettled people because they had never needed me to assert it before. I noticed a shift in how I was spoken to, more attentiveness, more caution, as if people were suddenly aware that I was no longer bound by the same unspoken obligations. They asked fewer rhetorical questions. They documented more carefully. They began confirming things in writing, not because I asked them to, because they could feel the absence of my quiet corrections approaching. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were procedural, cultural, subtle, and they were irreversible. Once a system loses the person who absorbs its inconsistencies, it has to confront them or redistribute them. Neither option is comfortable, but I wasn't there to manage that discomfort anymore. My role had changed, not through confrontation, but through removal. And for the first time, the system had to remember itself without leaning on my silence. The urgency arrived late, not in a rush, not with raised voices, but with a change in tone so subtle it almost passed as concern. Almost. As my final weeks approached, the questions shifted. They were no longer about process or handover. They were about intent, about whether my decision was final, about whether there was room to revisit things. The language softened. We value you. You've always been a stabilizing presence. Maybe there were misunderstandings we can clear up. Misunderstandings. The word appeared everywhere, as if naming it could undo what had already happened, as if ambiguity, once acknowledged, could be neatly reversed. I listened carefully, because now, for the first time, people were asking about my experience. They wanted to know when I had started feeling this way, what moments stood out, whether there had been something specific that pushed me to decide. They were looking for a hinge point, a single incident they could address, apologize for, adjust. But this wasn't a door that had closed suddenly. It was a corridor I had walked down slowly, deliberately, until turning back no longer made sense. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I said my decision had been considered, that it reflected a longer-term assessment of fit, that I was confident in it. I didn't recount examples. I didn't list discrepancies. I didn't explain how often my memory had been questioned, how many times conversations had been denied, how long I had carried doubt that wasn't mine. Not because those things didn't matter, because explaining them now would have changed nothing. The offers began to surface, a different role, more visibility, a chance to reset expectations. Language is designed to signal flexibility without naming the cost of previous rigidity. I recognized it for what it was. Not manipulation, but delayed recognition. A realization that something valuable was leaving, paired with uncertainty about how to replace it. What they didn't understand was that the value they were trying to preserve was no longer available on those terms. I had already reclaimed it. There was a moment, brief, almost unspoken, when I could sense regret. Not remorse for specific actions, but for not noticing sooner, for assuming stability without understanding its source. They began remembering things differently. Suddenly, conversations I had once been told never happened were vaguely recalled. Decisions previously framed as unclear were acknowledged as probably discussed. The tone shifted from certainty to hedging. If it had happened earlier, it might have mattered. Now it was too late, because trust, once fractured quietly, doesn't respond to sudden attention. It responds to consistency over time, and the time for that had passed. I stayed calm. I thanked them for the offers. I acknowledged the sentiment. I declined. Each refusal was met with another attempt to reframe the situation, not as a systemic issue, but as a solvable misunderstanding, something that could be fixed with conversation, alignment, and a renewed commitment to clarity. What they didn't see was that clarity was no longer the issue. Choice was. I had chosen not to stay in a system that required me to doubt myself in order to function smoothly. I had chosen not to accept recognition that arrived only when absence became visible, and that choice, once made, could not be reversed without cost. The final days were cordial, almost warm. Too warm, perhaps, as if goodwill could compensate for timing. I didn't resent it. I understood it. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like politeness layered over urgency, like kindness deployed too late. When I walked out for the last time, nothing dramatic happened. No final confrontation, no emotional exchange, just a quiet ending, and the certainty that whatever they were trying to fix now was no longer mine to carry. The closest thing to a confrontation happened on my second to last day. It wasn't planned. There was no agenda. Just a brief meeting requested by someone senior. Someone who had been present for many of the moments that had quietly shaped my decision. The room was neutral, glass walls, afternoon light, no audience. They started carefully. "I want to make sure we didn't miss something," they said. "You've always been steady. This feels, unexpected." I nodded. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. They asked if there had been a breakdown in communication. If there were specific instances we could discuss. The questions were measured, professional, and almost gentle. This was the moment I had once imagined. The one where I would finally explain. Lay out the pattern, reclaim the narrative. I didn't, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed to. I said there were times when my recollection of conversations didn't align with how decisions were later described. They paused. I continued evenly. Over time, that made it difficult to trust the process. No accusations, no examples, just a statement of impact. They responded quickly. "I don't think anyone intended that. Memory can be tricky. Context changes." I didn't disagree. "I understand," I said. "That's part of why I'm comfortable with my decision." Silence settled, not tense, but reflective. They asked if anything could change my mind. I said no, not firmly, not defensively, just clearly. The conversation didn't escalate. It didn't need to. There was no argument to win, no truth to prove. The facts, as I experienced them, were no longer up for negotiation. They thanked me for my honesty. I thanked them for the conversation. And that was it. What struck me afterward wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. They didn't deny my experience outright. They didn't challenge my memory. They didn't attempt to reframe events in that moment, because they couldn't, not without reintroducing the very dynamic I had named. That was the quiet power of the exchange. By refusing to argue details, I removed the opportunity for dismissal. By speaking calmly, without emotion, I made my experience difficult to minimize without appearing indifferent. There was no heat because there was no resistance. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was closing a loop. When I left the room, I felt lighter, not because I had finally spoken, but because I hadn't over-explained. I hadn't defended. I hadn't tried to extract validation from someone who had only begun to understand too late. That restraint mattered. It preserved my dignity. It preserved the truth without turning it into a spectacle. And it ensured that whatever they thought about my departure afterward, they couldn't reduce it to emotion or misunderstanding. I had been calm. I had been precise. And I had finished. That's what confrontation without heat looks like. Not silence, but containment. Not aggression, but finality. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is just enough, and then stop. Leaving didn't feel like an escape. It felt like alignment catching up to action. In the weeks after, I noticed how different my days felt. Not lighter in a euphoric way, but steadier, quieter. The background hum of vigilance I had carried for so long was gone. I wasn't bracing for reinterpretation or mentally reviewing conversations after they happened. I trusted my memory again. That might sound small. It isn't. When you've spent years second-guessing your own recall, the return of that trust changes how you move through the world. I spoke more directly, not louder, clearer. I asked questions without cushioning them in apology. I noticed when something didn't align and named it calmly. And when it didn't align, I no longer assumed the fault was mine. My sense of self shifted in subtle but important ways. I stopped equating composure with compliance. I stopped confusing adaptability with obligation. I learned that being calm doesn't mean being endlessly accommodating. Quiet doesn't mean invisible unless you let it. I didn't carry bitterness with me, not because what happened didn't matter, but because I understood it. The people I worked with weren't villains. They were operating within incentives that rewarded certainty over accuracy, momentum over reflection. And I had participated in that system longer than I should have, by absorbing its friction. Owning that part freed me from resentment. I also noticed something else. In new environments, people read me differently, perhaps because I carried myself differently. I still listened more than I spoke, but when I spoke, I anchored what I said. I followed up in writing without apology. I didn't wait to be invited into clarity. And people adjusted, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer negotiated my own perception of reality. That's the difference. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to tell my story loudly or often. I didn't need closure from the people I left behind. The closure came from knowing I had chosen myself without turning that choice into a performance. If there's a lesson here, it's not about leaving jobs or confronting gaslighting directly. It's about recognizing when your calm has become a container for other people's avoidance. There is a point where patience stops being generous and starts being self-erasure. And that line isn't marked clearly. You only see it once you've crossed it. I crossed it quietly, and I crossed back with intention. Who I am now is not harder or sharper or more guarded. I'm the same person, observant, restrained, principled. But now my silence belongs to me. My memory belongs to me. My clarity belongs to me. No one gets to rewrite it unless I allow them to. And I don't. There's a quiet kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises or headlines. It leaves hesitation. It teaches you to soften your sentences, to doubt your recall, to treat your own certainty as something that needs permission. It doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives as politeness layered over denial. And because it's subtle, it often goes unnamed. What happened to me wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was a gradual erosion of trust. Specifically, trust in myself. Being told over and over that conversations I clearly remembered hadn't happened didn't make me angry at first. It made me careful. It made me quieter. It made me adapt. And that adaptation was rewarded until it wasn't. The moral of this story isn't that you should confront every inconsistency or document every interaction in anticipation of conflict. It's not that you should assume bad intent or turn every workplace into a battleground. It's this. If you are consistently asked to question your own memory in order to keep things running smoothly, the problem isn't your memory. And if your calm is only valued when it absorbs discomfort without recognition, that calm is being used, not respected. Quiet dominance doesn't look like winning arguments or exposing flaws. It looks like knowing when to stop compensating, when to stop translating your clarity into something more convenient for others, when to choose yourself without needing permission or applause. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I became clear about what I was carrying that wasn't mine, clear about what I was being asked to doubt, clear about what staying would cost me. And that clarity didn't require anyone else to agree. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in it, if you've ever replayed a conversation wondering whether you imagined it or softened your truth because insisting felt risky, I want you to know this. Your experience doesn't need consensus to be valid. You don't have to make it louder to make it real. You don't have to prove it to everyone to honor it yourself. Sometimes the most powerful response to quiet erasure is quiet authorship, choosing how the story continues, even if you don't control how it's remembered by others. Before I go, I want to leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to invite reflection. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, and later realized the peace was costing you your trust in yourself? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your answer in the comments.